But you have a very unique life after film school in that your life after film school involves being back at film school.
Indeed.
So why don't we start there? Tell us your name, when you went to film school, and yeah, just drop that part because I
All
think it's
right.
interesting what you're doing now.
My name's Jacob Bricca. I went to film school. Well, I mean, I went to undergrad. I was in a film studies program in undergrad, and that was from 89 to 93 at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And then after three years after graduating, I went to American Film Institute. And I started in 96, and I was there from 96 to 98 in the editing program. And following that, I started my career in Los Angeles as an editor. But 4 years after graduating, I got an opportunity to teach. And I went back to my alma mater, to Wesleyan University, and started teaching first as an adjunct, and then it kind of stuck. And I was there in various with various titles until for like 11 years, and now I've been 10 years teaching at University of Arizona in a tenured position. So yeah, I'm now helping run a film school.
Yeah. While all the time, always still editing.
Indeed, yeah, that was really important to me, and it was something that was tough to at times to keep going because teaching is a full-time job. But it does, there are long summers, and there are long winter breaks, and there are sabbaticals, and there are ways to make that happen. So I really did at AFI, I really did come to really take on an identity as an editor, as a film editor. And then more, mostly as a documentary film editor. And I felt fortunate that I'm not on the same kind of career path that one would be if one was full-time editing, but nonetheless, every couple of years, I managed to get myself on a feature. So.
You think it's important for film educators, film professors to keep doing it, to stay sharp?
It sure helps you, seem relevant to your students in the classroom.
They respect you more if they know you're doing it. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think one can be a great teacher without doing that. I don't think that there's any hard rules about that. But there are, like some of my best lessons just come from here's a problem we were trying to solve, and here's how we solved it, or here's the note that we got that led to the path of solving it or whatever. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And with something like editing, which is it's always involving the newest technology, it's probably really important to, you don't necessarily have to be using it, but to at least know it, be aware of it, right?
Yeah, and I do my best with that. You also have to be humble enough in the classroom to just go ahead, to not be defensive when somebody shows you something that you didn't know about before, because there's a lot to keep up with, and so yeah. But I think just having the mindset of knowing what kinds of shortcuts you're looking for and what kinds of things are helpful. I mean, a big part of my editing classes is really process. It's really about process, and then it's about principles of like what are we, in the big picture, what are we going for? Because every single editing decision has so many different factors in it, and it's rarely like, oh, this is clearly the best answer and this is clearly not the best answer. It's all of it is weighing positives and negatives. This one is clearly a slightly better performance, but there's something technical that is an issue here, and how can we work around that or whatever. So but yeah, keeping up on technology is a big part of it.
When you say process, what exactly do you mean by that?
Thanks for getting back to that. I mean, it's really easy these days, or I think always, but especially now that things are digital as of 30 years ago, that you really can just kind of dive into like, okay, I've got my dailies, I've synced them up, I'm gonna start those scenes, and if one doesn't have a process for, first of all, organizing all that raw material, and then making selects and reviewing selects, and basically going through this whole viewing, digesting, ingesting, sifting process, then you're in this sort of haphazard place where you've gotten to a cut, but you don't necessarily know why you're there, I think. And eventually you're going to have to go back and look at alternates, and look at at different different takes that you didn't use. And the way to get there better is to spend some time up front, just really immersing yourself in the footage so that you already have that shorthand in your head, which, is gonna, oh yeah, I remember I saw that thing. That's something we could look for, and then really, when is a cut finished? Well, sometimes there really is just a deadline, and you have to get there. And with television, that can be, you really do just have to get to the best thing that you have at the deadline. But if there's any wiggle room, you always want to get to a place where you know why you made the cut you did, right? There are little imperfections here and there, but we already explored all the options, and this really is the best. This is the best option for, given the whole of the story, given the whole of the film.
Yeah. And I mean, it is an art, right? Editing is an art. And with all of the arts, you're teaching a process, but then also I assume once they get to a certain level, then they find their own process, right?
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, I try to teach them, here's the process that I'm gonna strongly recommend you use, but every editor, and then here are shortcuts, here are keyboard shortcuts, or things that, but look, I mean, it's a tool, and you find your way of using the tools best, and whatever way that is, within reason, is the best way for you, and it's always fascinating to me to hear about how what processes different editors use. And we actually had Jen Lame, who edited Oppenheimer, who was one of my first classes. The second year I taught at Wesleyan, she was one of my students. I was her teacher when she did her thesis film. And she talked about she's cut 3 films for Noah Baumbach. And she said, yeah, he's crazy. The number of takes that he rolls, it's just, it's in the 20s sometimes. And so she will go through with every line of dialogue, like just a single line or a phrase or a sentence, and cut all 24 takes of that fragment and put them back to back, and do things like that in terms of making selects. And
because that's how he wants to watch them, just back to back.
no,
To back
that's
to back.
just how she wants.
Oh,
That's how. I mean, I think they've worked together enough that now, that's something that maybe he expects. But this is something that she came to, just because, kind of like me, you really do want to know that you have found the best take,
yeah.
and given certain, the peculiarities about the kinds of films that he makes and the way that he shoots, for her, that's the best way to get through it. It might not be the best way for somebody else, but yeah.
So wait, this Jennifer Lame is your student that edited Oppenheimer?
Indeed, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and I mean,
well done, Jacob.
she's done amazing. She's Hereditary. She edited Black Panther,
Right.
Wakanda Forever. 3 films for, as I said, Noah Baumbach. Lots of other interesting stuff. The film that's playing at the Sphere right now in Las Vegas.
Oh, the Darren Aronofsky film.
Yep. She edited that. So
Okay, she's
yeah, I
she's
mean,
on
and
fire.
she's got her pick of projects at this point, and I would be surprised if she, I think she's got a really good shot at the Oscar this year for the editing.
Oh yeah, yeah. Have you had her come in and talk to the class?
That's what I was talking about. She came in. It took a
Oh,
while because she's very busy, and I just had to respect when she was like, "Look, it's not going to happen." But I found her and I said, "Look, yes, I know you're going to be having finished picking up your kids and you have to do it from your car, but we would love to have you nonetheless." So that's what it was. It was her on her phone from having just dropped off her kids in LA, and we
it's a
got
nice
her.
lesson in being balancing your life with your work, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, even if you're not like always working, if you can bring in someone like that and say, I taught this person, you have your class forever,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And she just made some such interesting, like Hereditary, for instance, working with Ari Aster when they first had a conversation about working, she was incredibly honest with him. She's like, I really don't like horror movies. It's really not my bag. And he was like, look, I don't like most horror movies either. Like yes, it's a horror movie, but it's really, like it only, and also in that film, she said, the only reason why it's scary is because the dramatic scenes, like the only reason it's scary is if you really, really believe the all the rest of it,
right.
and
You get so involved in that family drama, that family tragedy happening.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
And that's really what it is. Right.
That
And
has to be
then,
real to you. That has to
yeah.
really feel like you're in it, you're real. Then the scary stuff will be scary. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Well, she must have some stories because I've heard about the post of that movie, and the producer wanting it to be one movie, and Ari obviously making the movie that we ended up seeing, but that it got pretty contentious.
We didn't have time to get into that. Or she was just being diplomatic and wanted to talk about what she
Yeah,
wanted.
no, it's probably yeah. Anyway, that's her story to tell. We'll ask her that when she's on this.
Sure.
Um, okay, so let's go back because we got to get to film school. So you go to Wesleyan first.
Mhm.
Did you know you wanted to be an editor then? Because that was an undergrad general film education.
No, I knew I wanted to go to a place that had a good film program, but I wasn't sure of myself in my, future career choices enough to say, like, I didn't apply to USC, for instance, or a school that would have been, like if you had gotten in, you would have been like, well, I can't turn this down, and this is kind of you are kind of making a choice about your career. The liberal arts idea was something that was attractive to me, and so I went to a place that was a liberal arts school that had a good film program, and I was also a sociology major, and I discovered documentaries there. I didn't really think about documentaries before college, but sophomore year of college, I took an amazing class, and I was sort of hooked, So that's what I came out of that program with was a love for documentary and a desire really to just make documentaries. It was very vague at that point. I didn't have much direction beyond that.
Did you get a chance to make anything, shoot anything, edit anything?
I had an internship which turned into a job, a paid internship which turned into a job at a tech company in my hometown, actually in Palo Alto, California, that I was doing basically corporate video. But we had access to equipment, and I was using that equipment to make my own short works and stuff. So I was doing it for a living, even though it was a very non-glamorous, the stuff we were shooting wasn't particularly interesting. Uh,
Sure, but a great way
but
to cut your teeth and getting paid to practice is always good.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then I got laid off from that job, and that's what caused me to think about what my next move was. Because at that point, I was starting to get hired for things, but it was really scattered. I would get jobs doc shooting sometimes. I was editing sometimes. I was sort of all over the map, and having something like that happen really forced me into thinking, what do I want? I was living in San Francisco. I loved the city, which was not the ridiculous expensive place that it is now.
Right.
But I kind of had to look around and say, like I don't know that there's enough going on here film wise to really, like, I had to be honest with myself. This is a really fun place to live. But I looked at people who are 10 or 20 years older than me, and I was like, that, the kinds of careers that they had were maybe not as, as advanced as they could have in a place that had more film going on.
Yeah. So you're doing corporate videos in a basically Silicon Valley.
Yep.
Was there any like, early encounters with any of the people that we know now, the Zuckerbergs, the
Well, the,
Musks?
the company was owned by Paul Allen, who I
Oh,
believe passed away not too long ago, but he was the co-founder of Microsoft,
yes, I
Bill
know who he
Gates,
is. Yeah.
and the owner of a vast fortune, which
Yeah.
he put towards things like building museums about music and Jimi Hendrix in Seattle, but also in making this company called Interval Research Corporation. It was like a several $100 million gamble, to just hire all these researchers and let them loose and sort of invent the future or whatever, and nothing really much came out of it. But
Yeah.
the people who were there, had some interesting ideas and were pursuing them. That was, yeah. But the reason I got laid off actually was basically, I remember that situation in the HR office, and the woman who ran the HR department saying, well, do you know why we're letting you go? And I was like, no. This is kind of a cushy job. I sort of like it. And she said, well, we can tell your heart isn't really in it.
Oh,
uh,
wow.
and they were also, in a way, it felt a little paternalistic, or maternalistic. It was a woman who was telling me this, but her saying, look, the best thing for you is not to be here. That was what they were telling me. And in the short term, I thought they were wrong, but in the long term they were absolutely right. It forced me into considering what I wanted to do, because they like the ladder at this place or in Silicon Valley as a filmmaker was not, I mean, you can make good money making corporate videos in Silicon Valley, but that probably would have, I would have been very unhappy doing that in the long term. So
Yeah.
that's what caused me to think about film schools for graduate school. And I considered and got into three of them, and two of them were journalism programs. One of them was at Berkeley, one of them was at NYU, and those were very attractive to me. for different reasons. And one of them was a broadcast journalism. I would have been doing documentaries. But then the third one was AFI, where you work. And I was editing, and it was a very interesting moment because it was sort of like I wanted to see myself as like a muckraking journalist, single-handedly, working on things as a documentarian.
Change the world. Yeah. Like,
But I had to be honest with myself and say, actually, this, learning a craft in Los Angeles, which growing up in the Bay Area at the time, like LA was the enemy.
oh, I grew up in LA. I'm an LA native, so I remember those days. There was that huge rivalry, which I feel like doesn't exist anymore. But
not so much, yeah.
yeah.
And I think LA never really cared as much about San Francisco as San Francisco did about LA. For San Francisco,
True.
LA was the enemy. For LA, San Francisco was that place over there.
Yeah, you go there for the weekend. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, that was an interesting choice to say, actually, this place had something more to teach me, because these other ones, I had actually done quite a bit of documentary work by that point. I mean, I wasn't I had tons more to learn, but I had actually made a few to several short documentaries of my own. I had worked on others, whereas I had never worked on anything narrative fictional in my life, even at film school at Wesleyan, because I had been so documentary focused. So it was something new for me to learn at a school like AFI, which was not going to be a place where we were going to work on documentaries, but we were going to be working on story, and I was going to be learning Avid for the first time, and I was going to be, so that was all attractive.
How were you editing before that on the corporate videos? What was the system?
Wow. I mean,
Works?
this was at a place where, because Final Cut didn't exist before, we were actually, we had an online editor, right? So you literally went from tape to tape,
Wow.
Yeah.
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 Okay,
Yeah.
so it was an opportunity to take a big leap in as far as that too, which is
Yeah.
a big part of it.
Yeah.
But you're definitely saying like, okay, I'm putting the documentary journalism, activist side of me to the side, right?
At
Or did
least
you bring that into AFI? Were you
yeah,
like,
in the short term, yeah. I mean, I always told myself, look, it's 2 years. I can leave LA when it's over. I can, by the time those 2 years were over, I realized that would have been the stupidest thing for my career that I ever could have done, right? Because I had just spent 2 years, like developing friendships and contacts with at least the people who I was in my classes with. And this is where the most work was going to come to me, right? This is where I was going to have the most opportunities to learn in a work environment. So, and by that time, I stopped hating LA so much. And kind of I was more neutral. And by the time
yeah,
I left, I really kind of liked it, or I was at least heading there. And I was ready to take anything. I think, do you want me to talk about the first job I had after grad school?
I do. I want to talk about grad school though, but like you're already
Okay.
there. So tell us about the
Okay.
first job
Well,
you had.
because it's
Because we're gonna edit this anyway.
it's a pretty good story. Well, I
Okay, let's hear that.
hope I can make it a good story. So, I got a gig right out of grad school as the editor on an indie feature, right? And which was sort of incredible, right? I mean, I
As
had
the lead editor.
the lead editor over the
Okay.
previous summer. I had the lead assistant job on an indie feature, like $1 million indie feature, which was great, but it was an assistant job. But this was something that I should have known was too good to be true, because it was. And the people who made this film later had lawsuits against them. They later had these were people making films who basically were raising money from people who didn't know any better in the Midwest, under false pretenses, to create these films where it didn't really matter whether the film got released or not, because the whole point was just to employ the the producer in making this film, and he put his daughters in the film, and
Yeah.
it was this kind of a gig. So it was.
Right.
And I started taking notes by the end, because the things that were happening on this production and in this post-production were so absurd that they were actually kind of funny. And they were making a film where, the director, actually, who was the guy who was also the producer who was scamming people, said to me on the, like, I was in Santa Monica and I was seeing the dailies, and he said, "So what kind of a film do we have? Is it like a drama, or is it more like a dark comedy?"
You don't know it at this point? Was it in the script?
Like,
Was there a script?
Yep. And I mean, pretty much everyone who worked on that film at one point was either, in production, was either fired or left. Because his wife, who was also a producer, would go on these tirades and just sort of fire people at will. And then the people who, had their eyes open were like, I'm getting out while the getting's good. Like these checks are starting to bounce, like that kind of thing.
So you
So,
got fired?
no, eventually I left. I
Oh,
because I mean at first I was getting paid on, well, first my salary shrank to like 2/3 of what they had promised. And I was like, all right. But then every week it started to get harder and harder to actually get paid. And I would literally be going across town to a bank somewhere and they said, your check will be there. You can get your, like it was that kind of a situation. And then those stopped happening. And I was like, okay, well, this, not to mention that the film itself was like, it was a mess. There were so many continuity. There weren't like small continuity errors. There were huge gaping holes of continuity, where it was going to be very hard to make a film that made any sense out of what they had shot.
yeah.
So
Do you
anyways,
know?
maybe the lesson there was that and it was kind of funny, but it didn't help my career at all, right? There weren't any contacts I made that I didn't already have, the people who I would want to work with again, really. And I got paid sort of, and so I maybe should have, done something else.
But how did it come about? Was it through AFI people?
Yeah, I mean, one of my friends at AFI was being hired as the line producer, and he
Oh,
was he was able to filter, funnel suggestions for various crew positions to the director
hmm.
and producer, and I said, wonderful.
Yeah. Hey, it's exciting. You get your first job, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean,
Lesson learned. I mean, what is the lesson? Like, do some research on these people first.
in a way, I mean, when I tell my students about this, I say, look, you're going to go through some things that aren't going to be ideal. Like no matter what first jobs you have, it might not be something like that where you're working with totally crooked people, but it might be something where you're in a situation that you're just ill-suited for, like it's not a good match, or it is going to be something that's, like where the artistic value of it is going to be very minimal and you're going to learn some things, not others. And like that's okay. It's okay that you have experiences that aren't a straight path towards whatever your goal is, or figuring out what your goal is. You are going to bounce around a bit. You're gonna,
Yeah.
and so maybe that was the thing that taught me how to be a little more skeptical, to have a, to be able to think about that too good to be true idea, to think a little more long term or whatever. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if the lesson is that I shouldn't have taken it.
No, I don't.
But
I don't think so. I mean, I
yeah,
think you're lucky because you got it early, right? Some people get that lesson their fifth or sixth project, and then it's so you got it
perhaps.
early, and now you can go. Now you can actually enter the industry with some life experience, and
Yeah.
also you were smart enough and brave enough to leave the project, right? And that's
Yeah. I
that's a
mean,
good lesson
it
to
was,
teach your
it
students,
was
like,
about to collapse. I mean, it was only a week or two away from there being
right?
much left,
But
but yeah.
knowing when to leave,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
you didn't know with the corporate job, you had to be encouraged.
That's true. I had to be forced.
Forrest. But like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great story and a great lesson
Good
because
point.
a lot of times, like, we never want to be, we're being rejected, right? And nobody
Yeah.
wants that feeling.
Yeah.
And then you realize that's that turning point where you had to make a big life decision and
Yeah.
it worked out.
Yeah.
But when you choose AFI,
Mhm.
right, you have to apply to a discipline,
Mhm.
even back then, right?
Yeah.
So you had to choose editing,
Yes.
and you could have chosen directing, you could have
Yeah.
done producing because you were doing all that within making docs, right? So why editing?
It's funny because applying to AFI, even just seeing the list of disciplines and thinking about it, that was a really useful thought experiment, like, because I realized, okay, given the education that I already had and what I've been doing professionally, doing a generalized, graduate degree in film production, I sort of thought was going to be a little bit of, like I knew a lot of that already, that really for me to go to film school, it needed to be specialized. I knew that much. And then looking at the specializations, as soon as I kind of thought about that, it was super clear to me. Okay, editing, I've always loved editing. I mean, it was the part that was always the most intuitive to me. It was the kinds of films I made, some of them at least were really, they were sort of editing projects. They were found footage pieces where I was just kind of mixing and matching things in ways that it was sort of built in the editing or whatever. And so it was just sort of having to make a choice and then thinking, oh, like it sort of crystallized my thinking about it. And believe it or not, even 2 or 3 years out of undergrad, I still had never really thought deeply about what these crafts were and that there was actually an identity in a craft position, you know? I
Yeah.
think sometimes, you know, that you are, and probably more in those liberal arts schools, and at that point in time, my idea of what the industry was still very vague, you know, and it was still it was a bit of a more of a romantic idea of I'm going to be an indie, you know, filmmaker who's going to do it all themselves, you know.
Hmm. Was there a
So
model?
the idea, go ahead.
Was there a model of like a filmmaker that you were like, that's my career goal
I
now?
mean, you know, when I first saw Michael Moore's first feature, Roger and Me, that was a, you know, like at the time that was a pretty new. There were some new things that he was doing. His tone, his point of view was kind of electric, you know. So maybe, you know, like that was very influential. Ross McElwee made a film called Sherman's March, which actually was still a little bit before my time, but that's something that I saw in undergrad. That is it's like a personal doc, and he
Hmm.
has a very unique voice, you know, literally and figuratively, and it's sort of a laconic look at his own life. And so there were things that were sort of like, oh, as a filmmaker, you can just sort of go through life and encounter things and make those things into a movie, you know?
Yeah. All right. So you get into AFI, big life change, but a short move. You're right down the coast.
Yeah,
A lot of people, come from all over or
yeah.
internationally,
And
which I'm
international,
sure.
very much,
But
yeah.
how international was your class?
It felt very international to me. I don't know what the figures were, but I mean, you know, I remember encountering, you know, folks from Argentina, from South Korea, from Mexico, from other places in the Far East. So it again, I don't know what the numbers were, but it felt like there was a pretty healthy international presence
Yeah.
from all over Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. I was part of the reason I love it. It's adds so much flavor. And now we're at like 50% international.
Wow.
Yeah. The hard part now is getting, keeping them after they graduate because
Yep.
it's so hard to
Yep.
the rules are so hard to be able to stay here.
Yep.
If you graduate. As you know, you work in education. Okay, so let's talk about those first, not moments, but like that initial reaction being at AFI. Like a lot of people, feel this thing called imposter syndrome. Do you do you, do you, I mean, here's the thing. Either people feel it and they talk about it, or they feel it and they lie about it. Everybody experiences it,
I no, you know what? Like I don't remember
except Jacob Bricca.
I don't remember feeling that way because
You had experience. You had a lot of
oh,
experience.
okay. Like in the other disciplines, I definitely felt that. I couldn't believe the quality of the work that people were showing on their reels as cinematographers, for instance. I
Oh,
was like,
they're
why are you
always, they blow you away. You're like, why are you in school?
right,
Yeah.
right. And yes, I felt overwhelmed by, you know, understanding, you know, what does a production designer do? You know, like these, because I had not been in Hollywood. I had been in this documentary land in a different city. And so yes, all of that was somewhat overwhelming. And I felt like I was learning a ton and needed to learn a ton. But as an editor, I looked at what, you know, it was a thing at the time where there was an evening in which people showed little 5 minute snippets of whatever they wanted to from their reel. It was a way of getting to know each other.
Yeah.
And I felt like what I showed was pretty good, you know, like I
Yeah.
didn't feel like I was like behind in terms of my own discipline. Like I didn't know Avid yet. I was going to have to learn that, you know.
Right.
But
But it was Avid was so new, so everybody was probably
I mean,
starting at zero
it was a
around
few
there.
years into it, but yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we were on like, I don't even know if they use AVR anymore you know, these are gradations of digitization where
Oh.
we were working at AVR4, AVR5, AVR6, which is basically means that you have a really crappy looking image on your program monitor where you can
Oh.
really tell whether things are even in full focus, you know?
Oh, but so because it's easier to edit, like the footage
Because it's
doesn't
highly
necessarily.
digitized because hard drive space was still at a premium,
Right.
and in order to
Right.
get X number of hours in, it had to be digitized at AVR5, which by today's standards looked incredibly crappy, you know.
Right.
And of course, in the online, everything's going to be fixed, but that was what
Yeah.
you were working with, you know. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So there was learning Avid. So let's talk about that. Talk about the learning curve, like the technical learning curve, and then the more, I guess, artistic learning curve.
The technical learning, you know, we had good classes on technical classes on learning the software. So you know what, I'm actually recalling that I had actually taken a class at Bay Area Video Coalition learning Avid back when I worked in San Francisco, but I don't believe that I had ever actually edited anything on it. So it wasn't entirely new to me. But yeah, like just the technical side was, I picked it up. I mean, back in those days, we relied on manuals.
Yeah.
We didn't
You
just
couldn't
go
do a YouTube
online.
search for something. Yeah.
Exactly, right.
Right.
That was not yet a thing. And then the artistic side of it, I just had like a collection of really wonderful teachers, each of whom had different strengths and brought in different kinds of material to teach us. Where we would, Howard Smith was a feature editor, lots of different kinds. I mean, he had edited disaster movies as well as much more indie artsy kinds of movies. Farrell Levy was a television editor, is still a very good friend of mine. We saw her at the book
Yeah.
event that I did at AFI.
Yeah.
She at the time was working on NYPD Blue, which was a big network, very successful network television drama. Brian Chambers also worked in television. Steve Cohen was working on features. So they all had different things to teach us. And then, so much of our editing came in just rough cut reviews where, the rough cuts would come in, all of my classmates would bring them in, the teacher would run a review session, and we would just, really dig into what was up with this cut and what could be done with it.
Yeah.
And you learn a lot by doing that, by thinking, I needed to learn to think like an editor and to, I think that one basic skill of the editor is to have that flexibility to always think of it as that it could be different. And you do, because you put something together and it feels very solid. It feels like that's the way it is. And to always remember that even in the things that are working well, they could be different.
Yeah.
Like what if we did this differently? What if we did that differently? And I felt like I improved a lot in a short period of time. And even the projects that I like first cycle, there were three different cycles of filmmaking at the time where, basically projects. And by the time I was in the third cycle, I looked back on what I had done in the first cycle and I was like, well, I could do that a lot better
Hmm.
now, and
Yeah.
that was all in the course of one academic year.
Right. Right. Because you were not coming from like scripted narrative
No.
filmmaking, editing, which is, I guess in a way it's a gift because in a lot of times in documentary, you're finding it in editing, a lot of pressure on you, and a lot of experimenting stuff. So now you have a blueprint, you have the script, but then, especially in film school, well, actually, no, every film ever made, you have to. It's made in the editing room still, right? You have a starting point, which is nice, but still there are so many options.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like, I've just done a very little bit of editing, but I what I love about it is learning that like you just said that there are so many different ways you can tell stories, but there's so many ways that you could fix something that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot of it is experience or getting someone to open your mind to something. But I talk about that first time when you found a trick, like, that those moments when you like you just play a little clip backwards and you're like, oh, now they're putting it down rather than picking it up. Those
I
things
mean,
that blow your mind that are so simple.
I think it's I'm not sure I'm going to come up with something so specific, but it is that thing where you look at something and in your earlier stages of development, you're like, well, we're stuck. We've got
It
this.
is what it is.
Right, at
Yeah.
least for this particular part. And there is almost always some way to fix something. And so the cheat, of course, is just, well, you're going to cut away from it so that you don't have to see the thing that sucks.
Yeah.
You cut the thing out that sucks, or you just cut away from it so that you can minimize there's a way around it. Or just coming up with a different idea of what the um kind of like where the true dramatic high point of the scene is, or something like that. And I feel like I came into it, the thing that I was good at already was rhythm. I felt like I had done enough where, and I think that all good editors have a really strong sense of rhythm, that they either, came with or have developed or whatever. Because, a really well edited film, I think, is often kind of a musical experience. You are being pushed through time and space in a very musical way, even if it's a series of, even if there isn't much cutting, like even if what you're doing is you're in the equivalent of a slow burn of a song, that
Mhm.
has very a very methodical, deliberate, unfolding or whatever.
Yeah, that's its own rhythm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
have any musical background?
Not formally, no. But I feel like some of the, like I was obsessed with music and with radio growing up.
Mm.
So, I just had radio, I had DJs that I loved listening to. The idea of what DJs did was fascinating to me. The way that they could, the seg between one song and another was something that,
Yeah.
with our little record, I mean, again, with the technology at the time and me being 10, we had one record player, right? So there's no way to do a segue between one song and another. So I would
Yeah.
stick on one record and get to the end of it with the needle. And then in my head, I would hit pause as I took the needle off, stuck the other record on, and put the needle down. And then I felt in my head what a great segue it was.
No, but that's great. And that shows that you're such an editor, because the best editors also think about transitions, right?
Yeah.
They don't just dip to black and then bring, I mean, that goes to the filmmakers too, but transitions in editing are so important. And so you're talking about that, right? And then you
Yeah.
become a pro and you get to do that, even with music, right?
I mean, we were just again with Jen coming into our class talking. One question I asked her was, where did you, in a couple of these Noah Baumbach films, well, one of them in particular, the one about the family with Adam Sandler, uh, uh, it'll come to me, where there are scenes that just end out of nowhere. Someone is literally in the middle of a sentence, right, and you just smash cut to the next scene. And I mean, it's not that it's never been done before, but they really
Yeah.
turned that into like a signature of that film, and it really makes some of the comedy, right? It
Yeah.
actually just creates a punchline where none has any right to exist, right? So really just continuing to think, well, what could we do here? What
Yeah.
how this scene doesn't need to end where it ended. It could end somewhere else. It could end very abruptly and just kind of like force us into something else.
Yeah. I mean, rhythm, like, comedy, horror that she's done too, like you were talking about, all about editing, all about rhythm, right? All about you can create those,
Yeah.
even if they didn't get it, you can
Yeah.
save a director's butt.
Yeah.
Talk about so that's a big part of, AFI, but it mirrors the real world. It's the collaboration part. And especially those first three films that you did, you worked with three different directors, right? And learning to adapt the way you work to work with those people. Just talk about that. And was there ever a learning, a teachable moment? Did you ever have a bad collaboration?
Uh, I think as an editor, you come to I learned this just by doing in various situations, that the editing room, which these days is sometimes kind of a virtual space because there's so much remote work being done, but in whatever space it exists in, is also a collaborative psychological space in which you have people who have certain roles to play, there are certain power dynamics and certain um, idiosyncrasies and fears and pressures and such. And I think to some degree, the editor is sometimes kind of at that stage can be sort of like the hand holder and the cheerleader of a project in a way,
Yeah.
where someone needs to be able to say, it's fine. We're gonna, we'll pick this up tomorrow, and I've got some ideas, or to just sort of be that calm voice in the room where other people are freaking out for one reason or another, and also the choice of how to get your ideas across, and that there's thinking about, well, what's the best moment to bring this up, or what's the thing to do to guide things in that direction rather than forcing it on people. Things like the sort of the soft skills
Yeah.
that our teacher, Steve Cohen, would always say, editing is 70% psychology.
Yeah.
And,
Probably. Yeah.
both in the thing that you're creating, because you're creating psychological portraits, but also in the work that you do. And I think just being a diplomat goes a really long way, being able to think about your own needs and put them aside a little bit or modulate them, and to be thinking in a strategic way about how you can help things go well for other people, basically.
Yeah.
And there are limits to that. If you have someone who is truly kind of abusing their authority, or who is just doing things that are not right, then you have to put up some limits. But it really, I did serve me to learn that, and to, the one filmmaker I've worked with a few times, like I kind of discovered, okay, this is what happens when they get stressed. I need to
Yeah.
remember that this is what happens when they get stressed, and I don't need to freak out about it, at least not right then. Like if this continues, past the stress point, then we've got something to think about. But you sort of learn where people are at, and so those things are really important.
Yeah, it really is the most intimate relationship in filmmaking because you're, well, virtual now, but you're traditionally you were in a small space together for a very long amount of time.
Yeah.
And it's also it's the most vulnerable part, especially for the director, because they're getting to see what they actually ended up with and they have to deal with now. And, I'm sure, do you have any tips on how to present that first cut to someone? That's hard.
Uh,
It depends on the person, I'm sure.
yeah, I think it just depends on I think it just depends on how many times your counterpart has been through this before.
Yeah.
Because you learn as an editor to, especially in documentary, in the books that I've written, I really stress the idea that your first rough cut is going to suck. You should just like just count on it.
Yeah.
And not that you want it to suck, but you really, and that is especially true in documentary where you don't have a script. You are going to be frustrated that in that first cut things are not working as well as they're going to, and that's just a learned skill to having, just having done this several times, you can now start to see it as part of the process rather than an alarm bell, a warning signal about something that is, necessarily, I mean, it could be a sign of a project that's in real trouble, but just as likely, if not more likely, it's just the sign of it being the first cut.
Yeah.
And it's just, you need that starting place. You have to get to a first cut for any of the other ideas to bubble up.
Yeah. I mean, it applies to writing too. You need that first
Yep.
draft, right? For people to react to, for you to react to. And it's best to just get it out as quickly as possible, like fail fast so that now you can start working on it. But yeah, that's good to hear. It's the same in documentary.
Yeah, and the same in any, and also I also counsel when you're looking at, so you have a cut and you've taken a bunch of notes and you're trying to figure out what to do, you kind of have to, you're going to have stuff that's going to be the real hard nut to crack, as well as the stuff that is, oh, like this is a clear 100% winner of an idea and it's not that difficult to accomplish. Like, go ahead and take a little time to do the fun stuff, do
Mhm.
the easy things, because just getting those sorted out is going to make you look at the harder problem differently, because the things around it are going to play better and differently, and you are probably going to come up with new and better solutions for the tough nut to crack, so
Yeah.
just kind of thinking about, and you can't do that to an extreme, because then you end up with a part of the film that is so unfinished with other parts of the film that feel very polished, and that is also a problem.
Yeah.
Then you're going to have work that you have to undo because you haven't done enough work in the unfinished part to know how the other things are going to have to change. It's all this interconnected organism
Yeah.
where so there's a balance between those things. But
It's psychological too, though. It
yep.
encourages you to go, oh, I know that part works. And you'll go back and watch it 100 times. And
Right.
then you'll slowly work on the other stuff. You're like, no, but it definitely, okay, keep going. It
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So let's talk about like you're getting ready to graduate school, right?
Okay.
Are you even in that second year? I mean, you seem very smart and, mature. Were you thinking about what's my next step? How do I establish a career? Were your classmates doing the same?
Yeah, I mean, there was a certain amount of definitely of trepidation and of worry, or of it's, I think that's always the case if you're entering back into the unknown. That's especially the case if you're actually have not been there before. So I
Yeah.
had worked for 3 years, basically, like it's a real win when you get out of college and you're just making a living doing something and supporting
Hmm.
yourself.
Yeah.
I try to tell my students, like, don't that's nothing to sneeze at. It's not like it's a, you have to revise your goals once you get to it, but just making a living waiting tables is like, you should celebrate that,
Yeah.
like that is different from being supported by someone.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're so anyways, I had been through that to some degree, but now I was in my goals were different. I was in an industry that I was sort of just entering. And yeah, I mean, you're hungry, you're hustling, you're trying to keep up with whatever contacts you've made and see if they have anything for you. And and just kind of taking whatever you can. I really was, yeah, you're just a freelancer kind of out there trying to make it work.
Yeah. And so we heard about that first film.
Yes.
So, well, was there any, planting those seeds while you were still in school? Were you making connections? Was there a mentor figure, like besides the faculty that you had?
Um, Not especially. I mean, had been people who had helped guide me think through the graduate school idea. I mean, of like whether to go or not, because I actually had an interesting decision. There was a job at Industrial Light and Magic, which I think is now just basically Lucasfilm, but this
Yeah.
is George Lucas's special effects company, up in Marin County that
The company, the company.
the company, yes. I mean, the ones who did Star Wars, like an amazing place to work that I was like, the job was kind of waiting for me. And that was right as I was starting AFI, and it wasn't a green light yet. But like 3 weeks into grad school, it was like, hey, there's this job at ILM for you. And
Oh, did
I had
you
to
thought
make that
about it?
decision. Yeah, yeah. But I definitely made the right decision in continuing on because
Yeah.
it was another job that it was for a really cool company and it was editorial adjacent, so I probably
Mm.
could have moved into editorial eventually, but it's still I mean, it's an amazing place to work, but it's still a place where a lot of people sort of get stuck because it is kind of in this different, it's kind of in this other part of the state, and it's kind of it has at least at the time it had a small company kind of vibe, where
Yeah.
you got a job there and you just stuck with it for life.
Yeah. They call it the
So
ranch, right? You work on the ranch?
it actually
Or
was
is
not
that?
at the ranch. You got to go to the ranch every now and then, but no,
Oh, okay.
these low-slung, really ugly buildings that were unmarked, right? That was part of it. It was like,
Oh,
nobody
you're
really
like,
knew
yeah,
where it
working for the
was.
CIA. Yeah.
Yeah, it was in San Rafael somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, I made the decision to keep up with graduate school, and I would, like I think what ended up being really useful were just some of my friends and now colleagues from film school. So I ended up, Matthew Bazell, who was a director in my program, we had really hit it off, and he was just such a fun person to work for. We had such a good time, me editing, him directing. And, I ended up editing 2 documentary features for him in the years that came. And he didn't set out to make docs, but he had a real love of music and he made 2 music docs. That was the work that he was, pushing forward and he could get. So, your networking like laterally is always a good idea, because not people aren't going to have work for you right away, but as everybody continues,
Yeah.
you're going to sort of go forward together.
Did you do anything besides editing after film school?
No, I was able to do editing. Again, some of it was pretty unglamorous. Some of it was for shows that I remember editing this show for was it A&E? I think it was called it's called Cop World, and it was a 2 hour special spin-off of like some kinds of cop shows, and I just realized by editing it that really the way that they made these shows was they just showed up in some city that theoretically had a lot of crime worldwide. Let's go to Rio de Janeiro. Let's spend a week with the police and let's see what kind of footage we can get. And then we will craft some kind of narrative out of whatever we get. Like there was no, and really your job was just to have every segment make sense, even though and so that when you went to commercial and you came back, you didn't notice the fact that the segment that came next didn't really follow from the one that you just saw previously. So it was sort of like it was about, tricking people into thinking they're seeing content when really they're just seeing,
This is
they're
the beginning of the end. This is now you're the reason that we all, we don't have attention spans,
luckily
right?
that was, one job for like 4 weeks, but
Or early reality TV. Yeah.
but luckily somehow the forces aligned, or my proclivities helped guide this or whatever, but ended up getting jobs in documentary. So I got a first feature, which was one of the only shows that I got, which was truly just answering a listing. Like I didn't know these people. I knew Spanish, which was turned out to be like a key selling point because the footage was very much, a lot of it was in Spanish. But so I got a first feature, which was an amazing thing, and those people ended up hiring me for several other projects afterwards. And
Which one
then
is that? What's that called?
that one's called Beyond the Border.
Beyond the
They
Border.
ended up
Okay.
making a film several years later, which was called Precious Knowledge, which is these are both documentaries, which didn't get a lot of like festival play, but was incredibly successful in the educational sphere. Like they had something like, 200, 300 screenings at universities. And then my second feature was this film, which ended up being like probably the biggest box office success of my entire career still, which was this film called Lost in La Mancha, uh,
Yes.
which was a documentary that starred Johnny Depp because Johnny Depp was it was about the making of a film. It was about Terry Gilliam trying to make his version of Don Quixote. And the filmmakers who made it didn't know that they were in for such a ridiculous story because they were just going to make a making of about Gilliam making Quixote. But what it turned out was that the whole project went through a spectacular collapse in Spain, and they had it all on tape.
Yeah.
And
No,
so
that film is infamous, in Hollywood because it was such a big, disaster of that film not getting made with
yeah,
Johnny Depp and Terry Gilliam, and isn't Marlon Brando involved? Right.
no, but
Well, is it he's in the movie though, isn't he?
no,
He's not?
no.
Wow. Why did I
Jean
not?
Rochefort was the lead. Well,
I know I saw that movie, but then I was trying to remember. Oh no, sorry, I'm thinking Orson Welles. Why did I say Marlon Brando?
yes,
I
yes.
was thinking of
Orson Welles is in it. Yes,
you.
yes,
You understand why I confused them
yes.
at that point in their lives.
Similar body type. Yes.
But can you talk like I've always wanted to ask. Uh, when I saw you at AFI, actually, I didn't know that you'd done that movie, and then when I was looking you up research for this, I saw it, and I was like, oh my god, we could do a whole class on this because you saw all that footage.
Yeah,
Like you saw a film starting to get made and then fall apart.
yeah.
What did you witness? What happened on that movie?
Well, a collection of factors, which I think is relatively accurately portrayed in the film, even though it's, in a mostly verite documentary, we just sort of let the audience come to their own conclusions rather than telling them. But essentially, Gilliam accepted a budget for a film. He accepted a budget which, while large, was really nowhere near as large as it should have been to make the film that he wanted to make, which then led necessarily to them creating a schedule which was much too brittle for like things really did need to go right. They didn't have a ton of room to maneuver when things would go wrong. And then they had an extraordinary number of things go wrong. Like, yes, they did have really bad luck, but if it had been scheduled in a way where they had room to maneuver, it wouldn't have been the disaster that it became.
Right.
So it was sort of in a way, it was very much about he had been wanting to make this movie already for well over a decade. This was like his white whale. This was the thing. And he wanted it so bad that he gave the impression as Nicola I'm forgetting his last name, but the cinematographer says at one point he gave the impression of doing a simpler movie than he was really doing.
Mm.
And then they had, incredible flash flood rainstorms, and they had their lead actor fall ill very early in the production for what were at that point were unknown reasons, and lots of stuff going wrong.
Yeah.
But watching it, I think I learned a ton from Keith Fulton and Lou Pepe, who were the directors. So there were like tricks in documentary editing, which I'm not going to remember the specifics of, which I was learning from them. Um, and then I think I definitely we started from the inside out. We started with all the verite stuff because that was the easiest to figure out how to cut it. And then we sort of built around it to figure out how we were going to introduce Gilliam, get people up to speed on what the movie was and what the challenges were, and then how to end it. But
Mm-hmm.
those core verite scenes of the film playing out in real time before your eyes were really fun to cut because there was an element of dark comedy to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I
Which
remember.
yeah, like it is kind of a funny movie in very painful ways, because so there's this scene where they're out in the desert and they've just found a way to actually shoot something because this has gone wrong and that. All right, well, let's shoot this now, right? And right when they do that, jets, these NATO jets, which they have been warned about like weeks prior, like this could be a problem, but which they, were like, well, it's only supposed to be an hour a day or whatever. These jets, which are just like make it impossible to shoot sound for anything, starts, zipping across the sky. And we had all these shots of all these people like looking up, and just, sort of taking, and of course, those were over the course of like an hour. But you take several of those and you stick them into one scene, and everybody starts looking up, including Johnny Depp. And Johnny Depp, I don't remember, like there are all these little things that happen just with people's body language. There was another point where Nicola, the cinematographer, he goes, he's just talking about, he's trying to describe what shape the film is in. He does this, and lots of worried looks and lots of really which is amazing that they got all this stuff, because again, they didn't know what movie they were making at the time.
Were they making us one of those just simple like making of a movie, like behind the scenes
Yep.
coverage? Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, they wanted to make it into like a feature and not just sort of, a collection of featurettes, but essentially it was pre-sold to various European television outlets. So they had the budget already in, like the majority of the budget, done before they even started, because Gilliam is quite well known all over Europe, and the fact that it was going to have Johnny Depp in it, okay, sold.
Yeah, exactly. And I heard that they went to Gilliam to ask like, are you okay with us making this movie? And he said, well, at least one movie should come out of this disaster. So
Yep. And they had developed a relationship with him they had made a film called The Hamster Factor, which they shot while Gilliam was making 12 Monkeys, with Brad Pitt. And so they had already been through the experience of making a documentary about him, and he sort of they had a shorthand and they trusted him.
Right.
He trusted them, and he had very little editorial interference in our documentary.
I was going to say, did he ever come into the room and take a look? No.
No. He had some really good notes for us too, just good story notes on, just as a disinterested observer. He of course wasn't disinterested. I mean, he asked us for one thing where he asked us to change some words because he was in frustration. He spoke ill of Johnny Depp,
Right.
And that's not something that you want as a director out there for the whole world to see,
No, of course not. But so that's kind of like you're just starting out. You're getting these big. I mean, that was theatrical feature for a documentary, which back then was rare, and then it did well.
Yeah, it played all over the world. There were posters in Greece. There were, it was a big deal.
So what's the reality of that? We all know that what it does for the directors and all that kind of stuff. What does it do for an editor? Does it get you an agent? Does that mean anything? Does it put you on the map? Do you get calls?
It's funny because this is where, was like a decision that I had made, which was to start teaching at Wesleyan. And that was when the film came out. Like it was during my first year teaching that we went to Berlin and went to the festival there to I think is that in March? Anyways, it was, I mean, like the film was just coming out. Like we didn't know that it was going to be the success it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I had been working full time as an editor, I could have gotten an agent, and my career would have that I can't be sure of that, but I think that would have been easier to do. But I was now working full time as a teacher. So this was, like a difficult, somewhat frustrating experience where I had taken a job because it was going to be interesting, but also sort of for some of the security it would provide. And now I like, oh, wow, am I going to leave this behind in order to go follow that dream now that it seems a little more possible? And I chose not to. I chose to stick with teaching, because I did get a few, calls, where, and things that definitely could have led to the next feature, which I more or less had to turn down.
And
but
you had relocated to the East Coast?
Yeah. And I was near New York, but I wasn't. I mean, it was like a solid 2-hour commute to New York, and I was teaching, and in those, I didn't yet have I was a young, inexperienced teacher, so which means that it was twice as much work as it is once you know what you're doing.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true. And when you start out, you're passionate. You want to save every kid that comes through your door. Not that you've gotten cynical now, but like, it's like
I had to navigate that and be okay with and like you said earlier, I did continue to get things to cut, which was really all I wanted. Like it was there were some times where I wondered whether I should just come back to LA or but I just chose not to, at least in part because the teaching was really fun. If it had purely been a means to an end, then I would have left it behind, but
Right.
it held a lot of inherent satisfaction. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can totally relate to that as someone who
yep.
had no interest in education, and it does suck you in if it's the right fit and it's the right
Yep.
situation and the right, right people around you. But yeah, I'm looking at your credits right now, and you didn't stop editing, that's for sure. You have a
Yeah.
ton of credits after that. So, but one credit I want to talk about is an author credit. You wrote a book. So what, writing a book is not a quick process. I hear. I've never written any yet. But when did that start? Why did you want to write that book? Why did you want to write a book? And talk about the origin of that.
I'll plug it right here. This is the
Look at
second
that.
edition.
This guy's good at marketing.
So yeah, I wrote this book, which this just came out in now it's 2014. In 2013, the second edition came out, but the first edition came out in late 2017, and I got approached to write it. So it actually was an opportunity that came to me. It wasn't one that I developed from whole cloth. So an editor at Focal Press was at a presentation that I gave at a conference called University Film and Video Association. It's a yearly conference, which a friend of mine, Michael Kowalski, who is now a dean at Chapman, Dodge Film School at Chapman, but we were both starting out as young teachers. He told me, "Hey, you should come to this conference. It's fun. You get to meet other professors, et cetera." That was one of the best decisions I ever made because I ended up going every year. And something like this happened, which is I gave a cool, what the editor thought was a cool presentation about some aspect of editing. And he contacted me a week or two after and said, "Hey, I really think there isn't a really, really good recent book on documentary editing. I think you could write such a book. What do you say?" And then of course I had to actually create the proposal. Like all he did was give me the opportunity. But it wasn't my idea to begin
Was
with.
it daunting when it was presented to you?
Yeah, sure. It was, I've never done this before. So the interesting thing is I went about it in the only, and this is what I also counsel people in editing is, and it was sort of like what you talked about earlier as well, figure out your process. How is it that it makes sense to you? Because I went about it in much the same way that I would edit a documentary. What I did was I just started gathering raw materials by doing two things. One, just watching documentaries. Like, okay, I'm going to just make a point of like watching a bunch of stuff and starting to think about the things that I was curious about in those films or things that I could have a comment on or whatever. And then two, interview other editors because for me at least I didn't have a real strong community of fellow documentary editors necessarily, and I had just been at the Sundance Lab fortunately with another film made by Keith Fulton and Lou Pepe, Bad Kids, and I had just met this collection of an amazing collection of other editors some of whom were with films being workshopped and other of whom were the teachers helping guide us, give notes and everything. And, about at least half the people who I reached out to were people who I had met quite recently at that program, doing long form interviews, just asking them, what's your process? What do you, and as having worked on enough documentaries myself, I did know at least what questions to ask, And then I sort of took all this raw material, and that is one thing I know how to do, which is to like sort and sift raw material, and sort of see
Yes.
like see what
Yes.
comes out of it, because I didn't know what the book would be before I did all this stuff, but that's where it came from, was just being able to ask questions and think about things and then sift and sort
Yeah.
sift and sort and then find ways to have quotes explain concepts from people other than me, and then get feedback just like you do with I got so much feedback on the book, like what's working, what isn't.
Yeah.
I my first draft of things tends to be incredibly, well, not, tends to be quite wordy and not unnecessarily so. Same thing with editing. Like, can you express the same thing more directly and more cleanly?
Yeah.
Do it,
Yeah. No,
so
it's a great example of your process, in a different,
yeah.
medium. And it totally works. The more you talk about it, like this really just applies to most things in life, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And how long was that process?
I believe it was about 2 years of writing the
Years.
book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, which so I blew through a couple of deadlines, but not in a not in a crazy way. Like I think the initial deadline, when I really turned in the final manuscript, I was maybe 9 months after what I had promised, which is I have come to learn not bad at all.
Yeah. What's been the most rewarding part of that process? I know this book it's used as a teaching tool, right?
Yeah, it's come to be used in, I know USC uses it. There are film schools in London that use it. If you look at WorldCat, it's in libraries like all over the place. I know they use it at Chapman. So yeah, it has become, a definitive, book on that topic. What was your question? I've already.
Well, I was going to say, what has been the most satisfying
Okay.
or part of this
Well,
process?
I mean, I do come across people not like incredibly frequently, but with some regularity, somebody who pops up out of nowhere and says, "Your book was so helpful to me." Like I just like I was doing this, and it like just those kinds of things where someone has actually read it, and
That's the first thing. Because
which
editors, I'm sure, are just like, hey, okay, can we just start editing? Like, well, do I have to read a book about this?
I mean, all of us these days, right? I mean, I'm as
Yeah.
guilty of this as anyone. Like I love watching the next episode on whatever series I'm streaming. But so anyways, people actually read it and actually get something really useful out of it, like
Yeah.
that. I mean, what else can you ask for? And
Oh,
then
that's the best. Yeah.
yeah, and then having and also like there's a guy who wrote a much more sort of studies oriented intellectual book on documentary called Introduction to Documentary, which is probably used in any university course that's on documentary history or theory of documentary. They're probably reading that book. Bill Nichols, he said something nice about the book, and I was like, oh
Mm.
my God, this is like I consider that like I teach that book in my history of documentary class that's going to start on Thursday.
Yeah.
So kind of coming up into other people who were somewhere in an adjacent field who seemed to respond positively to what I had done.
You are their peer now, and get that quote and put it on the book when they put
Yeah.
out the next edition. Have you thought about it, because you are a filmmaker, thought about turning the book into like either a series of videos or translating it to that format?
I did a series of videos. They're very short. They're between 2 and 6 minutes a piece. So
Yeah.
I think there are maybe eight of them that I did as like I refer to them in the book, and they do teach, I think, in a short way certain concepts. I like seeing it as a video as opposed to reading it or in
Yeah.
conjunction with it. And I mean that was pretty labor intensive. And I still love doing those, and maybe I should be doing more. But a lot of what I do instead of that is, or I don't know, like I've sort of taken that skill and used it towards building lesson plans and slide decks for my classes, where maybe I'm not doing it as a really quickly edited video, but I'm giving a lecture that sort of has highly refined little talking points and little clips of things, and just making my teaching tools better. So
Yes.
my students get to have whatever that is.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna do just a few rapid fire things
Okay.
because we got to wrap it up soon. But I mean, definitely we got to do more because there's so much more to talk about. But okay, most important or it's the most impactful thing you learned in film school as a student and that you've learned as a teacher?
Wow.
Because you definitely, from my experience, you learn teaching. You probably learn more teaching.
Yeah. Well, I think impactful thing to learn as a student uh,
Well,
is
no, that you did
was
learn.
well that I did learn,
Yeah.
yes, was just a certain amount of humility of um, and this is something that you have to do, I think, as an artist, and especially and definitely as an editor, is to definitely fall in love with what you're creating. You have to fall in love with what you're creating. It's part of, what's going to attach you to it and what makes it meaningful. And then when someone takes it apart and has a critique of it, to find a way to use that in a positive way, and that's a learned skill, because it can feel very threatening when someone does that. It can feel like, oh, they just don't understand it. I just have to explain it to them better. I
Yeah.
just have to.
Yeah. Well, because it feels personal. You created this thing.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
So you have to both get really invested in it and have a detachment from it, and
Yeah.
somehow be able to modulate those things. So
Right. They're counterintuitive, right? They're the opposite, but you
I
have
felt
to.
like I got better at that. And
Yeah.
then learning by teaching.
Well,
Uh,
wait, can I just
yes,
drill down on that for 1 second? Because the other thing that you learn that's connected to that is how to give that critique, right? In a
sure.
that's focused on the work and that is not personal,
Yeah,
Did you have was that a skill you learned in school?
I think I
Or were you
must.
good at that from working in the
Yeah, no, I
profession?
think I must have. Uh, I'm having trouble recalling specific incidents, but as a
Yeah.
teacher, you have to do that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, and I don't know that I always succeed, because I sometimes find that something that I thought was delivered neutrally, or with a lot of support, it was still taken in a way that felt threatening.
Yeah.
And some of that is not up to me. That's up to the person who's going to receive it. But some of it is under my control. So I'm not always perfect at that. But one thing that can be a real um, understandable but nonetheless troublesome dynamic in school is that one really, I find with my students that they will default towards somewhat meaningless praise of each other,
Yep.
because they are friends and they do want, and they support the hell out of each other, and that's wonderful. It's like, but it can get in the way of someone getting a clear picture of what's really happening with their film. So I feel like I'm sometimes like the ogre who has to come deliver the bad news,
Or pushing them to do it to each other. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
And I 100% see that. And it's the trend is going more towards, or stepping away more and more from the critique part and more towards the encouragement part. So yeah,
And
we got
it's
got to push back. Unfortunately, you got to push back against that.
it's totally understandable, and I do, but
Yeah.
even though I fail at it sometimes, I do believe there's a way to do it with love, and with respect,
Yeah.
and that is because you do find that the best filmmakers do follow that. You don't get very far by, like, just, blindly pushing forward when everyone is telling you something different.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not setting them up for success if
Yeah.
you feed into that. Okay. As a teacher, what have you learned?
As a teacher, what have I learned? Oh my gosh.
What's the first thing that comes in your head? Learn about yourself, learn about the process, learn about life.
Um, I've well, I mean, I rediscover that the joy of creation a lot, which it can be it's something that once you're in the industry for a while, you do tend to get a bit cynical, and there are things where you really are just meeting deadlines, or where the art isn't always 100% necessarily the goal, but I I learn that process of creation is still is very much kind of a magical magic trick thing, and I love being near that. The excitement that the students have when something really does go right, and when they've created something that didn't exist before.
Yeah. That very well said. I can totally relate to that. And a great note to end on. Is there life after film school, Jacob Bricca?
Oh, absolutely, there has to be.